The evening air was crisp as expensive cars pulled up to the Grandview Country Club. Valets rushed forward to open doors, revealing men in perfectly tailored tuxedos and women draped in designer gowns that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Tonight was the annual charity gala, an event that the wealthy elite of the city looked forward to all year. Victoria Hartwell stepped out of her silver Bentley, adjusting her diamond necklace that caught the light from the club's grand entrance. At 52, she was the kind of woman who commanded attention wherever she went. Her perfectly styled blonde hair didn't dare have a strand out of place, and her emerald green dress hugged her figure in a way that screamed expensive taste. Victoria owned 3 successful businesses in the city and wasn't shy about letting people know it. Behind her emerged her usual companions for these events. There was Patricia, her longtime friend who ran in the same social circles, always eager to gossip about whoever wasn't present. Then came Diana, younger than the other two but desperate to fit in with the established crowd. They moved together like a small parade, their heels clicking against the marble steps as they entered the club. The Grandview Country Club was the kind of place where membership waiting lists stretched for years, and even then, money alone couldn't guarantee entry. Tonight, the main ballroom had been transformed into something magical. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables covered in crisp white linens. Each table held elaborate flower arrangements that probably cost more than what some families spent on groceries in a month. But what really caught everyone's attention was the magnificent grand piano, positioned on a small stage at the front of the room. It was a beautiful black Steinway, its surface so polished you could see your reflection in it. The piano bench sat empty for now, waiting for the evening's scheduled entertainment. James Washington had arrived at work 3 hours early that evening. At 28 years old, he had been working at the club for almost 2 years now. He took pride in his work even when it wasn't always easy. James had learned to navigate the complex world of the country club, where a smile and professional attitude could make the difference between a good night and a terrible one. He straightened his black vest and adjusted his bow tie in the staff mirror. His uniform was always spotless, his shoes always shined. James understood that in a place like this, appearances mattered. But more than that, he took genuine pride in providing excellent service. It was something his mother had taught him years ago when he was just a kid, helping out at her small diner. The other staff members were bustling around, making final preparations for the evening. James checked his section one more time, ensuring every glass sparkled and every piece of silverware was in its proper place. He had learned the preferences of many regular members over his time here. Mrs. Chen liked her wine glass filled exactly halfway. Mr. Rodriguez always requested extra ice in his whiskey. These small details made the difference between good service and great service. As guests began arriving, James fell into his familiar rhythm. He moved between tables with practiced ease, taking drink orders and ensuring everyone had what they needed. The conversations around him were typical for these events. Business deals, vacation plans to exotic locations, complaints about minor inconveniences that most people would consider luxuries. But James had learned to listen without really listening. It wasn't his place to judge or comment on the conversations happening around him. He was there to do his job well and earn the money he needed for his family and his own future plans. Victoria and her friends had claimed their usual table near the center of the room. From here they could see everyone who came and went, which was exactly how Victoria liked it. She enjoyed being seen, but she also enjoyed watching others. It gave her a sense of power and control that she had grown addicted to over the years. The evening's cause was supporting music education in local schools. Ironically, it was a cause that should have been close to James's heart, though none of the guests knew why. The irony wasn't lost on him as he served champagne to people discussing how important it was to give children access to music programs, while having no idea that their waiter had more musical training than most of them combined. As the dinner service began, James found himself glancing at the piano more often than usual. There was something about seeing it there, so beautiful and waiting, that stirred something deep inside him. Music had always been his first love, long before circumstances had led him to this job, but he quickly refocused on his work whenever he caught his mind wandering. Victoria was holding court at her table, regaling her companions with a story about a recent business acquisition that had gone particularly well. She gestured dramatically with her wine glass, enjoying the attention and admiration from her friends. This was her element, being the center of attention among people who hung on her every word. The charity auction was scheduled to begin soon, and the energy in the room was building. People were loosening up as the wine flowed and conversations were becoming more animated. James noticed that Victoria's table had been particularly demanding tonight, constantly calling for refills and making requests that seemed designed more to assert dominance than out of actual need. But he continued to serve them with the same professional courtesy he showed everyone. That was who James was at his core. He treated every person with respect, regardless of how they treated him in return. It was a principle his mother had instilled in him, and one that had served him well throughout his life. The piano sat silently on its stage, the evening's entertainment still an hour away. James found his eyes drawn to it again during a brief lull in service. For just a moment he allowed himself to remember what it felt like to sit at a piano bench, to feel the keys respond to his touch, to lose himself completely in the music. But that moment passed quickly as someone called for his attention. The night was still young and there was work to be done. James had no way of knowing that this evening would change everything, that the beautiful piano calling to him across the room would soon become the stage for a moment that would transform not just his life, but the life of the woman who was about to make the biggest mistake of her privileged existence. The charity gala continued around him, filled with good intentions and generous donations, but also carrying the undercurrents of judgment and assumption that often came with such gatherings. Soon, those undercurrents would rise to the surface in a way that no one in that elegant ballroom could have possibly predicted. The charity auction had just concluded, and the mood in the ballroom was celebratory. Thousands of dollars had been raised for music education, and the guests were feeling particularly generous with their praise for one another's contributions. Victoria had successfully bid on a weekend getaway to Napa Valley, more for the status of winning than any real desire to use it. Wine had been flowing freely throughout the evening, and Victoria was feeling the effects. Not enough to be obviously intoxicated, but enough to lower her usual filters. She was in one of her moods, the kind that her friends had learned to recognize over the years. It usually happened when Victoria felt she needed to assert her dominance, or when something had irritated her earlier in the day. Earlier that week, Victoria had lost a major client to a competitor, something that had been eating at her pride. She hadn't shared this with her friends, of course. Image was everything in her world, and admitting failure wasn't something Victoria did easily. But the frustration was there, bubbling just beneath the surface, looking for an outlet. James was clearing plates from nearby tables when he noticed Victoria's table needed attention. Their wine glasses were empty, and Patricia was gesturing impatiently in his direction. He approached with his usual professional demeanor, ready to take their order. "Ladies, can I get you anything else this evening?" James asked politely, his hands clasped behind his back in the respectful pose he had perfected over his time at the club. Victoria looked up at him, her eyes slightly glazed from the wine. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, something about his presence irritated her tonight. Maybe it was the way he carried himself with quiet dignity despite his position. Maybe it was simply that she needed someone to take her frustrations out on, and he was convenient. "Another bottle of the Bordeaux," she said dismissively, not bothering to look at him directly, "and make sure it's properly chilled this time." James nodded, though the previous bottle had been perfectly chilled. "Of course, ma'am. I'll be right back with that." As he walked away, Victoria's eyes followed him. She noticed something she hadn't paid attention to before. Throughout the evening, during his brief moments between serving tables, James's gaze kept drifting toward the grand piano on the stage. It wasn't obvious, just quick glances when he thought no one was looking. A cruel idea began forming in Victoria's wine-clouded mind. She had seen this behavior before in people who thought they were better than their station in life. The way some retail workers acted like they were artists, or how some servers pretended to be actors between shifts. It was presumptuous, in her opinion. People should know their place. When James returned with the wine, Victoria was ready. She had been building up to this moment, feeding off the encouraging meant of her friends who were always eager to see her put someone in their place. Diana had been particularly egging her on, making snide comments about the staff throughout the evening. "Tell me something," Victoria said as James finished pouring the wine. Her voice was loud enough that people at nearby tables began to take notice. "I've been watching you tonight and you keep staring at that piano up there." James felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He had learned to recognize when situations were about to turn uncomfortable. "I'm sorry if I seemed distracted, ma'am. I was just admiring the instrument. It's quite beautiful." Victoria's smile was sharp, predatory. "Oh, so you know about pianos, do you?" She exchanged glances with her friends, who were starting to giggle in anticipation of whatever was coming next. "What's your musical background, waiter?" The way she said the word waiter made it sound like something dirty. James maintained his composure, but inside he was bracing himself. "I have some background in music, yes, ma'am." "Some background," Victoria repeated mockingly. "How wonderful. Well then, since you have some background in music and since you've been staring at that piano all night like you know what to do with it, why don't you go up there and play something for us?" The suggestion hit the air like a slap. Conversations at nearby tables stopped. People turned to look, some with curiosity, others with obvious discomfort at what was happening. James felt the familiar heat of embarrassment rising in his chest. But there was something else there, too. Something that surprised him. Patricia leaned forward, her eyes bright with malicious excitement. "Oh yes, that's a wonderful idea. We'd love to hear what our waiter can do with that beautiful piano." Diana was practically bouncing in her seat. "Come on, don't be shy. If you know so much about music, show us." James stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He could see the trap that had been laid. If he refused, he would be seen as having gotten above himself, pretending to know about music when he didn't. If he agreed and played poorly, he would be humiliated in front of all these people. But what Victoria and her friends didn't know was that James wasn't afraid of the piano. He was afraid of what would happen when he played it. "I'm not sure that would be appropriate," James said carefully. "I'm working tonight and I wouldn't want to interrupt the evening's entertainment." Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, nonsense. The scheduled musician isn't due for another hour. We're all just sitting here anyway. Besides, it's for charity, right? Think of it as your contribution to music education." Her friends laughed at this as if it was the cleverest thing they had ever heard. The laughter was cruel, designed to make James feel small and foolish. Around them, other guests were watching with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. Some looked away, embarrassed by Victoria's behavior but unwilling to intervene. James felt something shift inside him. For 2 years he had swallowed his pride, accepted condescension, and focused on doing his job well. He had been professional and courteous even when guests treated him poorly. But tonight something was different. Maybe it was the way Victoria had said waiter like it was a curse word. Maybe it was the laughter of her friends, or the way other guests were pretending not to see what was happening. Or maybe it was simply that the piano was there, calling to him the way it had been all evening. "You know what?" James said quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You're absolutely right. Music is important, and if I can contribute something to the evening, I'd be happy to." Victoria's smile widened. She was expecting to see him make a fool of himself. Maybe plunk out chopsticks or attempt some simple tune that would confirm her assumptions about people like him. She had no idea what she had just unleashed. "Wonderful." Victoria clapped her hands together. "Ladies and gentlemen," she called out to the room, "our waiter here is going to entertain us with his musical talents." More people turned to look now. Some seemed genuinely interested, others clearly uncomfortable with the spectacle. James could see the club manager across the room, looking concerned but uncertain about whether to intervene. James straightened his bow tie and began walking toward the piano. Each step felt both like the longest and shortest walk of his life. Behind him he could hear Victoria and her friends whispering and giggling, already savoring what they thought would be his humiliation. But as James approached the piano bench, something remarkable happened. The nervousness fell away, replaced by a sense of coming home. He had been away from this for too long, denying himself the thing he loved most because life had demanded other priorities. Tonight, that was about to change. Victoria thought she was setting him up for embarrassment, but she had no idea that she was about to give him the greatest gift imaginable, the chance to be himself again, completely and without apology. The room grew quiet as James sat down at the piano bench. He adjusted his position slightly, his hands hovering over the keys. For just a moment he looked back at Victoria, seeing her expectant smirk, her friends' barely contained laughter. Then he turned back to the piano, placed his hands on the keys, and everything changed. James placed his fingers on the keys, and for a brief moment, the ballroom held its breath. Victoria sat back in her chair with a satisfied smirk, already imagining the awkward melody that would confirm her assumptions. Her friends were barely containing their giggles, phones ready to capture what they expected would be an embarrassing moment they could laugh about for weeks. Then James began to play, and the world shifted. The first notes that flowed from the piano weren't the hesitant plinking of an amateur or the simple melody of someone with basic skills. Instead, what emerged was the opening of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most technically demanding and emotionally powerful pieces in the classical repertoire. James's fingers moved across the keys with impossible precision, each note crystal clear and perfectly placed. Victoria's smirk froze on her face. The giggles from her table died instantly. Around the ballroom, conversation stopped mid-sentence as people turned toward the stage, drawn by the sheer power and beauty of what they were hearing. James was no longer the quiet waiter in the black vest and bow tie. He was a musician in his element, and watching him play was like watching a master craftsman at work. His hands moved with fluid grace, his body swaying slightly with the music's emotional peaks and valleys. Years of professional training were evident in every gesture, every subtle shift in dynamics. The piece demanded everything from a pianist. Lightning-fast runs up and down the keyboard, complex chord progressions that required incredible finger independence, and emotional depth that could only come from someone who truly understood the music's soul. James delivered it all flawlessly, as if he had been born to sit at that bench. Patricia's mouth had fallen open. She found herself leaning forward, completely captivated despite herself. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. This wasn't the script she had expected when Victoria had started this cruel game. Diana, the youngest of the group, had completely forgotten about her phone. She was staring at James with a mixture of awe and growing shame. The laughter that had been bubbling up inside her just minutes ago had been replaced by something else entirely. She was witnessing something extraordinary, something that made her realize how wrong they had all been. Around the ballroom, guests were putting down their wine glasses and moving closer to the stage. Some of the older members who had attended symphony performances their entire lives recognized immediately that they were witnessing something special. This wasn't just good playing. This was concert-level artistry. Mr. Chen, a retired music professor who had been skeptical when the commotion started, found himself transported. He had heard this piece performed by some of the world's greatest pianists, and what James was delivering belonged in the same category. The technical skill was undeniable, but more than that, there was an emotional honesty in his playing that touched something deep inside everyone listening. James was lost in the music now, completely absorbed in the piece he had performed countless times before, but never under circumstances like these. Every emotion he had swallowed over the past 2 years, every moment of quiet dignity in the face of condescension, every sacrifice he had made for his family, all of it was flowing through his fingers into the keys. The piano responded to his touch like an old friend. This was a magnificent instrument, far better than the upright piano in his small apartment where he practiced when his neighbors were out. The Steinway's rich, complex tone allowed him to bring out nuances in the music that he had only dreamed of expressing. Victoria sat frozen in her chair, her face cycling through a range of emotions. The smug satisfaction had been replaced first by shock, then by something approaching horror as she began to understand the magnitude of what she had done. This wasn't some waiter with delusions of grandeur. This was a serious musician, someone with real talent and training, and she had set out to humiliate him. The piece built to its climactic moments, and James's playing became even more intense. His fingers flew across the keys in passages that would challenge even seasoned professionals. Not a single note was out of place. Not a single phrase lacked emotional depth. He was pouring his heart and soul into this performance, and everyone in the room could feel it. Mrs. Rodriguez, who served on the board of the city's symphony orchestra, was frantically trying to remember where she had heard about a young pianist named James Washington. The name was familiar, she was certain of it, but she couldn't quite place it. What she could recognize was extraordinary talent when she heard it. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, James brought out every ounce of power the piano could deliver. The final passages were thunderous, each chord landing with perfect precision and overwhelming emotional impact. He had transformed the elegant ballroom into a concert hall. and every person present knew they were witnessing something they would remember for the rest of their lives. The final notes hung in the air as James's hands stilled on the keys. For a moment, complete silence filled the ballroom. It was the kind of silence that follows only the most extraordinary performances, when an audience needs a moment to process what they have just experienced. Then the applause began. It started with Mr. Chen, who had been so moved that tears were streaming down his face. Mrs. Rodriguez joined in, her applause vigorous and appreciative. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. People were on their feet, some wiping away tears, others shaking their heads in amazement. James slowly turned on the piano bench to face the audience. The transformation was remarkable. The quiet, deferential waiter was gone. In his place sat a confident, accomplished musician who had just delivered a performance that would have been at home in any concert hall in the world. Victoria remained seated, her hands limp in her lap, unable to applaud. She felt sick to her stomach as the reality of her actions hit her fully. She had tried to humiliate this man, had set him up for embarrassment and failure, never imagining that she was the one who would end up humiliated. Patricia and Diana were applauding now, but their enthusiasm felt hollow. They could see the stares from other guests, some accusatory, others simply amazed by what had just transpired. They had been part of what was supposed to be a cruel joke, but instead had become witnesses to something beautiful and profound. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, the club's music director who had been running late and had only caught the final few minutes of the performance, pushed through the crowd toward the stage. She was a professional musician herself, had trained at some of the world's most prestigious conservatories, and she recognized immediately that what she had just heard was extraordinary. James stood up from the piano bench, straightening his vest and bow tie in a gesture that seemed both humble and dignified. The applause continued, showing no signs of dying down. Some guests were calling out bravo and magnificent. He walked to the edge of the small stage and gave a slight bow, the same respectful gesture he had been giving to guests all evening. But now it carried a different weight. This wasn't the bow of a servant to his masters. This was the bow of an artist acknowledging his audience's appreciation. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. How did you... But James wasn't looking at her anymore. His attention was on Dr. Hayes, who had reached the stage and was extending her hand to him with an expression of amazement and growing recognition on her face. "James Washington," she said, and her voice carried clearly through the ballroom. "I remember you now. Your audition tape. We've been trying to reach you for months." The crowd grew quiet again, sensing that something even more significant was about to unfold. Victoria's face went completely white as she began to understand that her cruel joke had set in motion something far beyond what she could have imagined. James looked at Dr. Hayes with surprise and hope flickering in his eyes. After 2 years of waiting tables and practicing alone in his apartment, after countless rejections and missed opportunities, something was finally about to change. Dr. Hayes stepped closer to the stage, her eyes bright with excitement and recognition. "James Washington, we've been trying to reach you for 6 months. Your contact information in our files was outdated. The symphony board met 3 times trying to figure out how to find you." James felt the blood rushing in his ears. The symphony had been trying to reach him? He had auditioned so long ago that he had given up hope. "Dr. Hayes, I sent my audition materials over a year ago. I never heard back, so I assumed—" "Your audition was extraordinary," she interrupted, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent ballroom. "We unanimously voted to offer you the position as our featured soloist for the upcoming season. We've been holding the spot open, hoping we could locate you." The crowd murmured with amazement. Victoria sat frozen in her chair, her face pale as she began to comprehend the full scope of what had just unfolded. She hadn't just tried to humiliate a waiter. She had tried to humiliate a professional musician, someone talented enough to be chosen as a featured soloist with the city's premier orchestra. Mrs. Rodriguez pushed forward, her memory finally clicking into place. "James Washington, you're the pianist who won the International Young Artist Competition 2 years ago. I was on the judging panel. Your performance of the Chopin ballads was absolutely breathtaking." More pieces of the puzzle were falling into place around the room. Several guests were pulling out their phones not to record another embarrassing moment, but to capture this incredible revelation. Mr. Chen was nodding vigorously, tears still on his cheeks. I knew I recognized that level of artistry. You don't play like that without years of professional training. James stood on the edge of the stage, still in his waiter's uniform, trying to process what was happening. For 2 years, he had been serving drinks and clearing plates at this very club, invisible to most of the people who were now looking at him with amazement and respect. I graduated from the Peabody Institute, James said quietly, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. Master's degree in piano performance. I've been working here for the past 2 years to pay off my student loans and help support my mother while she's been going through cancer treatments. The admission sent a ripple of emotion through the crowd. Here was someone who had sacrificed his artistic career to take care of his family, working in service while possessing talents that belonged on the world's greatest stages. Dr. Hayes shook her head in amazement. We had your old address from your school records, but you'd moved. The letters kept coming back. James, the position comes with a full salary, health insurance, and it includes solo performances with orchestras in 3 other cities. It's exactly the kind of opportunity that launches major careers. Victoria felt like she might be sick. The weight of her actions was crushing down on her. She had seen James night after night for 2 years, had been served by him countless times, and had never once bothered to see him as anything more than hired help. Worse than that, tonight she had actively tried to humiliate him, to put him in his place, never imagining that his place might actually be far above her own in terms of talent and achievement. Patricia leaned over and whispered urgently, Victoria, we need to do something. Everyone is looking at us. Indeed, several guests were glancing in their direction with expressions ranging from disapproval to outright disgust. Diana, the youngest of the group, was crying openly now. She was old enough to understand the magnitude of what had happened, but young enough to still feel the full emotional impact without the defensive walls that her older companions had built up over the years. James stepped down from the stage, and Dr. Hayes immediately began introducing him to other members of the arts community who were present. The conversation buzzed with excitement about upcoming performances, recording opportunities, and the kind of career trajectory that James had been dreaming about for years. But through it all, James kept glancing back at Victoria's table. Despite everything she had put him through, he wasn't filled with anger or resentment. Instead, he felt something closer to pity. He had learned long ago that people who tried to humiliate others were usually struggling with their own insecurities and disappointments. Victoria slowly stood up from her chair, her legs unsteady. She had to do something, had to try to make this right, though she had no idea how to begin. The eyes of the entire ballroom seemed to be on her as she walked toward where James was standing with Dr. Hayes and the other music lovers. The conversations quieted as she approached. James turned to face her, his expression neutral but not hostile. Victoria opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, struggling to find words that could possibly be adequate for what she needed to say. James, she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I owe you an apology. Not just for tonight, but for the way I've treated you for 2 years. The way I've treated all the staff here. The words came out halting and difficult, but they were genuine. Victoria was facing a moment of reckoning that she had been avoiding for most of her adult life. She had built her identity around her wealth and status, using them to make herself feel superior to others. Tonight had stripped that away, revealing the ugly truth of what she had become. I set out to humiliate you tonight, she continued, her voice growing stronger but thick with emotion. I wanted to make you look foolish, to put you in what I thought was your place. I was cruel and prejudiced and completely wrong about who you are. James studied her face, seeing something there he had never seen before. Genuine remorse, real recognition of the harm she had caused. It was a far cry from the smug, condescending woman who had challenged him to play the piano less than an hour ago. Dr. Hayes and the others watched this exchange with fascination. They were witnessing not just the revelation of James's extraordinary talents, but a moment of genuine human transformation. Mrs. Hartwell, James said quietly, I accept your apology. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do with the opportunity to make things right. But Victoria wasn't finished. The floodgates had opened, and years of behavior that she was suddenly seeing clearly came pouring out. It's not just tonight. I've been dismissive and rude to you and the other staff members for years. I've treated people as if they were less than human just because they were serving me food and drinks." She turned to address the crowd that had gathered around them. "I want everyone to hear this. What happened tonight was my fault. I tried to embarrass James because I thought I was better than him. I was completely, utterly wrong. Not just about his musical abilities, but about his character and dignity as a human being." The confession was painful to watch, but there was something powerful about it too. Victoria was dismantling the walls she had built around herself brick by brick. In front of everyone she had been trying to impress for years. "I want to make this right," she said, turning back to James. "I don't know how, but I want to try." James looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the imperious woman who had tormented him, but someone who was genuinely struggling to become a better person. It was a glimpse of redemption that neither of them had expected when this evening began. 3 months after that transformative evening at the Grandview Country Club, James walked onto the stage of Symphony Hall wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. The sold-out crowd of nearly 3,000 people rose to their feet in anticipation. This was his debut performance as the symphony's featured soloist, and word had spread throughout the city about the extraordinary pianist who had been discovered at a charity gala. In the front row sat his mother, tears already streaming down her face. The cancer treatments had been successful, thanks in large part to the health insurance that came with James's new position. Next to her sat Dr. Hayes, beaming with pride at the musician she had helped bring back to the world where he belonged. But perhaps the most surprising face in the audience was Victoria Hartwell, sitting in the 5th row with the expression of quiet wonder. She had purchased an entire box of tickets and donated them to local music students who couldn't otherwise afford to attend. It was one of many changes she had made in her life since that night 3 months ago. James sat at the grand piano and began to play the same Rachmaninoff piece that had changed everything. But tonight the performance was even more powerful, infused with the joy of someone who had found his way back to his true calling. The audience was captivated from the first note, and by the final crescendo there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The transformation in both James and Victoria's lives had been remarkable to witness. Within a week of the gala, Victoria had established a scholarship fund for talented musicians from underprivileged backgrounds. She had personally covered James's remaining student loan debt and his mother's medical expenses, but more importantly, she had begun the hard work of examining her own behavior and attitudes. The video of James's performance at the country club had gone viral within days, viewed millions of times around the world. The story of the waiter whose extraordinary talent was revealed through an act of cruelty had touched people everywhere. But James had used his newfound fame wisely, partnering with music education organizations to bring classical music to underserved communities. Victoria had undergone her own journey of transformation. She had enrolled in sensitivity training, started volunteering at local community centers, and most significantly, had begun treating every service worker she encountered with genuine respect and kindness. The change hadn't been easy and she had stumbled many times, but her commitment to becoming a better person was unwavering. The friendship that had developed between James and Victoria surprised everyone who knew them, including themselves. It started with her attending his first few performances, not out of guilt but out of genuine appreciation for his artistry. Gradually, they began talking before and after shows, and Victoria found herself learning not just about music but about resilience, dignity, and grace under pressure. James, for his part, saw in Victoria's transformation proof that people could change if they were willing to do the hard work of confronting their own prejudices and mistakes. Her journey from cruelty to compassion gave him hope not just for her, but for society as a whole. The impact of that one evening had rippled far beyond their personal lives. The Grandview Country Club had instituted mandatory sensitivity training for all members and had established a policy requiring respectful treatment of all staff. Several members who had witnessed Victoria's behavior that night had also begun examining their own attitudes and actions. Dr. Hayes had become something of a mentor to James, helping him navigate the complex world of professional classical music. Under her guidance, he had already been invited to perform with orchestras in 5 other cities, and recording companies were beginning to take notice of his extraordinary talent. Patricia and Diana, Victoria's former companions from that fateful evening, had reacted differently to the experience. Patricia had been largely defensive, minimizing her role in what had happened and eventually distancing herself from Victoria as she changed. Diana, however, had been deeply affected by witnessing both James's grace and Victoria's transformation. She had started volunteering with music programs in local schools and had developed a genuine passion for supporting arts education. As James's debut performance concluded, the standing ovation lasted for nearly 10 minutes. People were calling out "Bravo!" and "Magnificent," just as they had that first night. But now the appreciation was untainted by shock or surprise. This was simply recognition of extraordinary artistry receiving its due acclaim. Backstage after the performance, James was surrounded by well-wishers, music critics, and industry professionals. His life had changed completely, but success hadn't changed who he was at his core. He remained the same thoughtful, humble person who had served drinks with dignity and grace. Victoria waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching him. "That was absolutely beautiful," she said simply. "Thank you for letting me be here to witness it." "Thank you for coming," James replied. "And thank you for everything you've done to support music education in the city. The scholarship program you started has already helped 12 young musicians." Victoria shook her head. "That's not charity, James. That's just trying to balance the scales after years of being someone I'm not proud of." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, two people whose lives had been forever changed by a single evening's events. The cruel joke that Victoria had intended to play had instead revealed truths about both of them that neither had expected. "I learned something important that night," Victoria said quietly. "I learned that when we try to diminish others, we only diminish ourselves. But when we lift others up, we all rise together." James nodded. "Music taught me that years ago. In an orchestra, everyone has to listen to each other, support each other, make each other sound better. That's how beautiful things happen." 6 months later, James made his Carnegie Hall debut to rave reviews. The New York Times called his performance transcendent and a reminder of music's power to transform hearts and minds. Victoria was there in the audience, having flown in specifically for the performance. But perhaps more meaningful than the prestigious venue or glowing reviews was what happened afterward. James had arranged for 50 music students from underserved communities to attend the concert, their tickets and transportation funded by Victoria's foundation. Watching those young people experience Carnegie Hall for the first time, seeing their faces light up with possibility and hope, felt more rewarding than any critical acclaim. The story of James and Victoria became a powerful reminder that talent and dignity exist in unexpected places, that our assumptions about others often say more about us than about them, and that it's never too late for genuine redemption. Their unlikely friendship, born from a moment of intended cruelty that revealed extraordinary beauty, continued to inspire others to look beyond surface appearances and treat every person with the respect and dignity they deserve. Years later, when James had become an internationally recognized concert pianist, he would always remember that night at the Grandview Country Club as the moment his real life began. And Victoria, who had built a new identity around lifting others up rather than putting them down, would remember it as the night she finally learned to see the humanity in everyone she met. The grand piano at the country club now bears a small plaque that reads, "Music reveals the beauty in every soul. Listen carefully and you might discover something wonderful." It serves as a daily reminder to everyone who sees it that extraordinary things can happen when we set aside our prejudices and truly hear one another. Their story became proof that sometimes the most beautiful music emerges not from perfect conditions, but from moments of challenge and transformation. And sometimes the greatest performances happen not on grand stages, but in the quiet moments when we choose to see each other's full humanity and respond with grace.